Good morning, everyone. My name is Francis Hult, Professor of Education at UMBC. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's panel on literacy and education during challenging times in recognition of International Literacy Day. We have over 150 participants registered for this event, and we're happy to see you all here. I would also like to acknowledge a special guest, Candace Dodson-Reed, who is the Executive Director of UMBC's Office of Equity and Inclusion, who's also with us today. We welcome everyone. So today's panel deals with Literacy Day, and I'm going to begin with a brief introduction on International Literacy Day and how we can think about sustainable education. So International Literacy Day has been around for quite some time. It's celebrated every year annually on September 8th, with the goal of drawing attention to the essential role that literacy plays in human development, and also to advance literacy as one of the cornerstones for establishing sustainable societies. In 2020, in light of the COVID-19 crisis, the theme for International Literacy Day is literacy teaching and learning in the COVID-19 crisis and beyond, as this is something that has affected education and literacy development throughout the world. A secondary focus is the role of educators and changing pedagogies. Those of us who are involved in education are fully aware about how the role of teachers has changed dramatically in the past several months and how we've all had to adjust our pedagogies to dealing with new circumstances. And so International Literacy Day examines how we can think about the role of educators in light of the COVID-19 crisis, and also seeing the crisis as part of a larger trajectory in human society and where we go next. The International Literacy Day is supported by UNESCO, which is part of the United Nations. The United Nations has a set of what they refer to as Sustainable Development Goals. These are global goals for sustainable development that were signed by all member states in 2015. And these development goals are unique in the history of international development in that they are focused on both the developing and the developed world. And they involve not only governments, but also civil society, including educational institutions, NGOs, and public-private partnerships. And among them are 17 goals that touch upon all elements and aspects of society, from the natural environment to human condition and challenges. And one of the cornerstones of these 17 goals is goal number 4, quality education. And the fourth goal states that all member states of the United Nations should strive to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. In order to achieve this goal, a number of targets have been set, and I wanted to share with you just a selection of these targets to give you a sense of how the UN is conceiving education in the scope of global sustainable development. These are targets that are meant to be achieved by the year 2030. And so target number 4.4 is to substantially increase the number of youth and adults who have relevant skills, including technical and vocational skills for employment, decent jobs, and entrepreneurship. Target 4.5 is to eliminate gender parities in education and ensure equal access to all levels of education and vocational training for the vulnerable, including persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and children in vulnerable situations. Target 4.6 is to ensure that all youth and a substantial portion of adults, both men and women, achieve literacy and numeracy. And target 4.7 is to ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and culture's contribution to sustainable development. Now, again, these are just a sampling of the targets that are meant to be achieved by the year 2030. And as the United Nations points out, these are still targets. They are not achieved yet, and the COVID-19 situation has led to challenges in achieving them. However, there were challenges before. And so the title of our event is Literacy in Education During Challenging Times, plural. And so it's important to recognize that the challenges to literacy are not instigated by COVID. There were indeed a number of challenges that students have experienced for a very, very long time. For example, before COVID, up to 40% of the world's population did not have access to education in a language that they understand. And I think if we pause and reflect on that for a moment, that's a staggering figure, that 40% of the world's population doesn't understand the education that they have access to. How can we ensure that the students in the world are receiving education in a language that they have grown up with and that they can use to access opportunities? 773 million adults and children do not have basic reading and writing skills, again, before COVID. 51.2% of the world's population did not have internet access in 2018. This draws attention to the reality of the digital divide that people have experienced for a very long time and that has only become more salient during the COVID-19 crisis. And as another example, 736 million people live on less than $1.90 per day. And we know from previous research that poverty is one of the major factors that influences educational opportunities and success. And so these are challenges that have existed before COVID and challenges that educational researchers have worked on for many, many years in order to find ways to address them and support students in their educational development. So the COVID-19 crisis is indeed a watershed moment in human history, and it has not caused these previous challenges, but it has certainly exacerbated them. So as UNESCO points out in their statement on International Literacy Day, the recent COVID-19 crisis has been a magnifier of the existing literacy challenges, including the factors that I mentioned before, which deeply affect schooling and lifelong learning opportunities. And so that is something that we focus on here today in the spirit of International Literacy Day. The UNESCO, who is the organization that encourages us to recognize International Literacy Day, and who actually before our event this morning held an event in Paris, also online, addressing these kinds of issues. They encourage us to see the challenges, but also to see the opportunities and the next steps. And that is very much the spirit of our panel today. So in this context of COVID-19, there's an emerging need to revisit literacy teaching and learning for youth and adults, as well as the role of educators. In other words, how can we recognize the challenges that existed before, the educational research and work that was done about those challenges before in supporting students, and then use that information and that knowledge in light of the COVID-19 crisis to move forward? How have literacy teaching and learning, as well as educators, been affected by the COVID-19 crisis? What are some effective teaching approaches that should be maintained or expanded? And how can teaching and learning for youth and adult literacy be reimagined in times of COVID-19 and beyond? Because we are very much looking not just at the immediate emergency, but in what comes next in the years and decades to come. And so that is what our panelists will discuss today in their research. So an overview of today's session is a series of presentations. We will have 3 presentations of about 10 minutes each. We will then take a short 5-minute break and then continue with 3 more presentations of about 10 minutes each, followed by a 30-minute or so panel discussion with all people at the end. We encourage those of you who are watching today to type your questions in the Q&A box. You're welcome to do that throughout the panel. We will be saving all the questions for the panel discussion at the end, and so you'll have the opportunity to have your questions read to the panelists and discussed at that time, but we welcome you to type them as you go. So this is the order of presentation. All of the speakers today are scholars who work on issues of literacy at the UMBC Department of Education, and who also work with doctoral students in the Language, Culture, and Literacy program here at UMBC. And each of them will be speaking about work that is part of their ongoing scholarly trajectory and that touches upon how it can inform the future in light of COVID-19. So with that, I will conclude the introduction and we will turn the program over to Dr. Allen.
Good morning, everyone. All right. Thank you, Dr. Hult, for putting this panel in context and for the invitation, for inviting me to participate in this panel. I'm grateful for the opportunity to revisit an article that was published in 2019, I believe, in the Journal of Multicultural Education, entitled Transformative Vision, Examining the Racial Literacy Practices of a Black Male Teacher with His Black Male Students, to think about the relevance of racial literacy in this moment. Ardhanti Roy has described COVID-19 as a portal, as a gateway between one world or another, an opportunity to envision the world, and I would add education anew. I am from southwestern Pennsylvania, and historically, southwestern Pennsylvania has been known as, has been populated with coal mining towns. My maternal great-grandfathers were coal miners and unfortunately died of black lung disease. I start here because one of the practices was to take a canary into the coal mine to make the miners aware of any toxicity that's in the air. And so I use this metaphor often to think about Black and brown children and how they've been serving as canaries in the coal mine for a very long time, and that COVID-19 really, as Dr. Hult has mentioned, kind of amplified the inequities in education for Black and brown children. Before I begin, I really wanted to, kind of like set the stage and to give you a sense of the multiple pandemics that Black and brown children in the U.S. in particular are navigating. So we have continued state-sanctioned violence against African Americans in the U.S. So the recent shooting of Jacob Black, the shooting and the killing of Breonna Taylor and her, I believe that was in March, and her killers not being brought to justice, as well as the ways in which Black and brown communities are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And so the study that I am speaking from was conducted years ago, but can offer perspective for how we can come out on the other side more just. And this is just a brief description of a news story that points to the ways in which toxicity is still, even during distance learning, entering the homes of Black and brown children. And so the question that this study examined was, how does a Black male teacher utilize racial literacy as both a pedagogical tool and a lens through which to understand the socio-political context of his practice? And so you may be wondering, what is the connection between racial literacy and functional literacy and academic literacy? And I'm really, I argue that racial literacy is a part of both of those things, in the sense that if you're not able to critically make sense of the world and to make sense of what it is that you're reading, that literacy, that you're not fully literate. And so a part of critical literacy is understanding the racial dynamics. And so my work builds upon racial literacy research that's documented racial literacy practices of teachers with K through 12 students, as well as the development of racial literacy of white pre-service teachers in teacher education. The line of inquiry that I'm exploring through this work examines racial literacy as a perspective or a lens, and then as a practice for enacting humanizing and culturally sustaining pedagogies. And so this paper is informed by critical race theory, and particularly Lonnie Grenier's application of it to build her notion of racial literacy. So Grenier uses a historical context of the failings of Brown versus Board of Education to argue for a more dynamic framework for analyzing how race functions within social institutions in the U.S. And it identifies racial liberalism which is kind of defined or characterized by colorblindness and a belief in meritocracy and rugged individualism, as well as interest divergence as undermining the efforts to make schools more equitable. And so the components of her framework, first, looking at race as a tool, it really speaks to our need for, yes, we can look at disaggregated racial data, but that data should function as a tool for diagnosis, feedback, and assessment of the conditions within society and people's lived experiences. So not just to look at disproportionate data, but then to dig deeper and to really be able to identify what's contributing to those disparities. For reading race, it helps us to unpack how racism plays out in its psychological, interpersonal, and structural dimensions. So really this idea that we must examine race on both the macro and micro levels. And then finally, intersectionality helps us to interrogate the dynamic relationship between race, gender, class, and help us to understand how power subjugates different groups to various degrees, and that particular groups may act as, to continue that analogy, canaries in the mine. And so this presentation reports on research that is a portion of data from an embedded case study that examines the culturally relevant pedagogy of a Black male teacher who was intentional about supporting Black male youth, as well as his students' experiences of that pedagogical approach. And so you can see that the teacher was a 10-year veteran teacher, and the class where I collected my data was a class entitled Slavery in America that examined the transatlantic slave trade as well as colonialism in the U.S., but also the resilience of people of African descent to navigate slavery and the continued vestiges of it operating in contemporary society. And so the first finding that I'd like to share is this idea of reading race in the context of schools, the subtle ways that racism operates. Teachers working relationships with other faculty members can often support or constrain the work that they do with their students. And it can also reduce school-level professional capital. By understanding how the psychological dimensions of racism works, the teacher I worked with in the study was able to make sense of how teachers, particularly Black and Latino teachers, can feel comfortable teaching subtractive and or offensive curricula. In contrast to the racial lens that the teacher uses within his practice, faculty teaching from racially liberal perspectives view quality teaching as simply knowing one's content as opposed to transforming it to be inclusive and liberatory. While Marcus, the teacher I worked with, was confident enough in his practice that he was not intimidated by opposition from other teachers, this scenario does support Scarrett's argument for the need for professional development and professional learning communities that support development of racial literacy so that teachers may support one another and in essence speak the same language. Reading race in the context of schools, resistance. This finding really helps us to see how Marcus relied upon the racial literacy lens to make sense of the resistance that he faced from colleagues and administrators. And then reading race to facilitate students' cultural competence. Marcus's use of racial literacy enabled him to understand the psychological dimensions of racism and helped him to empathize with his students, right? So racism, we're all kind of like living and existing within under the fog of racism. And so he was able to understand the ways in which his students in his class had internalized notions of inferiority. It also helped him to understand the double consciousness, as W.E.B. Du Bois calls it, that his students were living within. And then it was also a lens to understand how the historical context of subordination, to help his students to understand the historical context of subordination, so that he could replace and they could replace the faulty racial narratives that they were exposed to with truth. And then lastly, Gwenier's final component of racial literacy intersectionality, enables us to identify the ways in which the educational system is failing various groups, not just students of color. Power as systematized through racism subjugates people who are not white, middle class, Christian, straight males to varying degrees. And so focusing on the underachievement of Black males, as I did in this study, should not be at the expense of Black girls or Black gay males, for instance, but for any student, racial literacy enables us to pinpoint the practices and policies that impede their opportunities to learn. And so in this quotation, we see that there's a need for culturally relevant pedagogy and humanizing pedagogies for Black boys, regardless of class, which is often the frequent go-to that people like to focus on class. And so some of the takeaways from this study is that racial literacy helps us to understand the shared experiences of a group of people without essentializing. It creates a common knowledge base to deconstruct continued marginalization, abuse, and miseducation. And then I just also want to point out that this is a starting point, right? That once you, so it's a starting point and it's not a final destination. So the development of racial literacy is really what kind of informs teachers' pedagogy moving forward. And so the implications for now, thinking about COVID-19 and that as I think about my own son who just started distance learning today, racial literacy helps us to unpack a component of humanizing pedagogy, which is Freire's idea of critical literacy, the ability to read the world and identify one's placement within it in order to transform the world. The second implication for now is that racial literacy really helps us to kind of unpack the tensions between what decision makers are saying must be focused on versus what teachers know to be necessary. And I would say add liberatory or critical teachers know to be necessary in this moment. So often we talk about access and distance learning as being having, access to computers and having internet access. But also we should be thinking about the things that get in the way of students' access to learning as they're navigating multiple pandemics. So racial injustice as well as COVID-19. But then also the alienating teaching practices and curricula that had been happening in brick and mortar schools. We need to disrupt those so that we're not taking those practices and that curricula and just transplanting it within children's homes. And so really, thinking about how we can engage funds of knowledge as well as culturally sustaining and humanizing pedagogies is what racial literacy helps us to move toward instead of continuing to bring the baggage of the past into this new future. Thank you very much, and I look forward to conversation.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I am Jennifer Mata-McMahon. I'm going to be talking to you about how a dual language program is supporting biliteracy for English language learners in a Baltimore City public school. And this is based on a research project that was funded by the Sherman Center for Early Learning in Urban Communities, which is housed at UMBC. So I wanted to present the research team is myself as a PI. I worked with Laura Burgraff-Bassett as my graduate research assistant. Ana Gabriela Salas is a teacher that works at this full service community school that I will be sharing here with you. And she is also acting as a co-investigator for our research project. and Joshua Michael is our quantitative data analyst. So the background is, this is a full-service community school in Baltimore City. It is a school that is a partner with UMBC and with the Sherman Center, and they are in the process of designing, implementing, and scaling a dual language program in response to communities' linguistic needs. So they're looking at the needs of their community, their growing Latinx community that speaks highly Spanish, and looking as to how they can respond to these needs. So they had initial support from the Baltimore City School District and continued later on designing and implementing this program spearheaded by the school staff and a teacher, particularly Ms. Salas, who is collaborating in this research project. So the purpose for our study is twofold. One is to document the design and implementation and scaling of this full-service community schools dual language program, and it's coming up to its fifth cohort, its fifth iteration, and we're using Coburn's conceptualization of scale. So we're looking at depth, sustainability, ownership, and spread of this particular program. And the second purpose is to gauge the impact that the program has on learning outcomes for these emergent bilinguals or English language learners. So the methodology of this ongoing study is a mixed methods design. The qualitative data is stemming from focus groups, interviews, classroom observations, and documents. And in the future, we are going to be collecting data from a survey carried out with all stakeholders. The quantitative data is coming from the M-Class Text Reading and Comprehension Assessment, which we call TRC. And in the future, we're collecting also the M-Class DIBELS data and the iReady data and the quantitative sections of the survey. The participants are all the students that are taking part or that are enrolled in the dual language program, the teachers of the dual language program, staff, administrators, and parents of the dual language program. In the future, we look to include the stakeholders for the mainstream program as well. And this is based on some of the findings that we have so far. So the demographics of the dual language students that are participating that were included in the quantitative data from the TRC scores that we received are this. You can see them in this table. They're mainly Latinx students, but there are also African American students enrolled in this dual language program. And you can see that cohort 1, we're looking at the scores from 2016 to 17 through 2018 to 19. And the first cohort started in kindergarten, and you see there the total of 19 students, then moved to first grade and second grade. Those are the consecutive years that we have for their scores. The second cohort started at kindergarten in 17-18 with 21 students, and the third cohort that we're looking at started kindergarten with 22 students in academic year 18-19. So this is the instructional model that the school has designed for the DLP, or the dual language program. And as you see here, they have recently incorporated last academic year a pre-K section with a 50-50 model and a third and fifth grade, or third through fifth grade, which hasn't happened yet, that has also, or will have also, a 50-50 instructional model. So in this study, we're looking at kindergarten first and second grade cohorts. The original cohort started in kindergarten since pre-K was not available at that point. So the kindergarten model was and continues to be an 80-20 model. The first grade is a 70-30 model, and then by second grade, the dual language program moves to a 50-50 model until, and continues that way. So findings, the qualitative findings so far, we found that, and this is looking at Coburn's conceptualization of scale and her 4 big pillars for it. So it was found that depth for depth, one of the more salient changes of the school's beliefs and norms of interactions was reflected in the newly acquired empowerment of parents for their involvement in their children's learning. So now that they could understand the homework that was coming home, they were much more involved in the learning process. And we're very excited about that ability to be part of it. For sustainability, it was noted that maintaining the models of instruction implemented in the DLP over time was going to be crucial. A key component of spread was the positive experiences students were having in learning in their native language and becoming literate in Spanish, as well as the word-of-mouth communication of these positive outcomes among families. These were paramount for sustainability and for spread of the program. And lastly, ownership was evident when all key stakeholders related the benefits they observed within the program, stating that even monolingual native English parents could benefit from Spanish classes. So when asked about the academic expectations for the students from the DLP program, one administrator shared with us, which I think is really telling of the investment that the school has in this program. So this administrator said, I'd like to be able to see them start to take AP literature courses, AP courses that they can take and get university credits for. And then I think them being, their intelligence and their ability to academically perform being strengthened would be one of the things that I'd obviously want to see. Them being global citizens and having an understanding of their community and the community around them, I think, is critical. So for the quantitative findings, again, we were looking at the TRC scores for academic years 2016-17 through 2018-19 for the English and the Spanish scores for the TRC. And we found that the dual language students enter kindergarten with a 0.543 higher reading level than the mainstream program students. So we did detect a selection bias in the students that were enrolled in this program. Regarding average growth by grade, we observed a lower growth scores for dual language students on the English TRC assessment in kindergarten and first grade. So, and they were confirmed through a t-test of statistical significance of 0.01. Conversely, dual language students seem to grow at a faster rate on the English TRC assessment in second grade than their mainstream program counterparts, which was a really interesting finding. And this was suggested by a t-test approaching statistical significance of the 0.1 level. So using an ordinary test least square regression model, it was estimated that the dual language program has a statistically significant but diminishing negative effect on English reading comprehension, as measured by the TRC in kindergarten and in first grade. In kindergarten with 3.2 levels of below, and first grade 1.7. The model estimates no statistical significant negative effect on English reading comprehension by second grade. So that's I think is a telling finding for the type of program that the instructional model that they're using at that grade level. The statistical model demonstrates that the estimated effect of the program is consistent with the anticipated lag in English proficiency in the initial years of the dual language program, in which the instructional model is one of 70-30 in kindergarten and 80-20 in first grade. Interestingly, once the instructional model moves to 50-50, there appears to be no statistical significant negative effect on English comprehension. So this is quite promising finding for this program in the future. So lastly, when looking at Spanish TRC assessment results, while limited, findings demonstrate that a promising trend of accelerated reading comprehension for students when assessed in the language of primary instruction. So initial descriptive statistics indicate that dual language students in cohorts 1 and 2 far exceed comprehension levels in Spanish in first and second grade when compared to their mainstream program peers assessed in English. So even though their scores in English in the beginning grades was lower, by the time they reach second grade, their Spanish grades far exceed if we compare the English scores of the mainstream students. So this is another exciting finding for the program. So in conclusion, the DLP has promising results that need to be confirmed with future cohorts regarding reading comprehensions as measured by the TRC assessment in both English and in Spanish, as students reach second grade and beyond when the instructional model moves to a 50-50 model. Further data need to be collected as the program spreads and scales up, and recommendations that we're making now point to maintaining the instructional model consistent and enrolling a broader number of newcomers and African American students in the program to address some of the issues that we identified of selection bias and also of equity, as they were reported by parents and teachers of the program. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kindel Turner-Nash. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share my work with some amazing teachers. Aide Dorn Melendez Morgan, Alicia Arce Boardman, Roderick Peel, and Carrie Elson. And today I'm going to be talking about work that focuses on practices that seek to disrupt and dismantle oppressive structures. This work with those wonderful teachers I showed you grew out of a national study of highly effective early literacy teachers in urban schools across the United States. While we know that there are exceptional teachers in all urban schools, we also know that teachers who work in urban schools are more likely to hold negative beliefs about the students they teach and adopt scripted, mundane curriculum. Dr. Allen spoke to many of the challenges in urban schools who mostly serve children of color. So with that in mind, I want to show that I always like to show this slide to unpack the term urban and understand that while we are speaking to the challenges of urban communities, we're also very much aware of the resilience of urban communities. Conceptually, this work is framed by Aide, who is a pre-K teacher, and her notion that children come full, and that our job as teachers in urban context, and especially now during the pandemic, is to find practices that sustain that fullness. Further, within culturally sustaining pedagogies, there's a focus on the framework of culturally sustaining pedagogies and focus has helped us find the language to identify and describe the kinds of literacy teaching these teachers are enacting. This framework's really important because much of the research that's been offered and marketed as a solution to the problem of low literacy proficiency has focused on children and families' perceived deficits rather than their capabilities. Further, critical sociocultural theory frames this project. Critical sociocultural theorists have long asserted that children are not uniform. The nature and extent of their literacy practices are shaped by cultural, linguistic, socioeconomic, and other personal factors and dynamics. So a critical sociocultural perspective advances the importance of human connection and of context. When framed by culturally sustaining pedagogies and critical sociocultural theory, we see literacy teaching in these teachers' classrooms as a process and a practice, as you can see here with this diagram, image credit Dr. Leah Panther. And as such, this work stands in contrast to a plethora of one-size-fits-all practices, websites, books, professional development materials that are often touted as the science of reading, golden tickets, standardized solutions, and linear solutions to problems in urban context. And I will add that these are issues that are not just relevant to urban context, but all contexts, as you saw in Dr. Hult's slides. This study asked questions about how culturally sustaining pedagogies informs teachers' ideologies about literacy instruction in urban schools and how they curricularize these understandings. We drew from a variety of approaches in order to both effectively amplify the work of the educators and for me to recognize my own positionality as I went about this research in classrooms of majority teachers of color who teach students of color. So today I'll be focusing on literacy practices for the beginning of the school year, because that's where we are. Creating a classroom community that sustains and fosters children as full people, as members of continually evolving communities is fundamental in order for iterative processes and literacy practices to take place. Now more than ever, during virtual learning in the middle of a pandemic, classroom community is going to need to look radically different. What does creating community even mean? Many teachers discuss this idea, but to create community is to connote that it wasn't there before. Diwana Smith, in her recent book, African Diaspora Literacy, discusses this as a superficial notion of community and offers an alternative rooted in the Africanist concept of communal love, defined as love that runs deep and is grounded in the affirmation that your existence, your success, your pain, your wounds are welcomed. The practices that I'm going to share exemplify communal love. First, to create communal love means to get to know children and families outside of school. This is possible even during a pandemic, as Alicia and Roderick visit the homes of the children that they will be teaching, wearing a mask, dropping off books, arranging read-alouds in the park. Gathering of stories is one way to get to know families before the school year begins. These are questions that have been adapted from a practice called story gathering by Leslie Koplow. And many of the teachers that I work with use this practice before the school year even begins. Helping students be together and learn together is important. One of the ways we do that is by helping them build a sense of identity as a group. One way we can do that is by coming up with a name for the class. This is possible now, even during the pandemic. After a series of discussions, teacher Carrie Elson and her class came up with their class name as the LeBron Sharing Class. Many of the kids were fond of LeBron James that year. Morning meeting is another structure that can easily be implemented during virtual learning. Here's what morning meeting looks like in 3 different classroom settings. Routines are also important. These teachers continue to teach the procedural knowledge that's needed to be successful in virtual learning. And you'll see a schedule for a 5th grade English Language Arts classroom that Alicia, our subordinate, is teaching right now. When children can follow certain routines efficiently, then those routines become more calm, more organized, and take up less time. It gives them more time for learning. For that reason, they can the teachers work with students to practice routines in many, many different ways. This has become even more important in the current context. Although none of the classroom teachers that I work with post classroom rules or make their own rules, all of them develop community agreements with their students. Every single morning, for example, of each year, including this year, Roderick and Alicia remind students during the first few minutes of morning meeting that they need to embody the 3 pillars which shape their school's culture that you can see here. To prompt students every day, they ask students, what does responsibility look like? What does respectfulness look like? What does it mean to be caring? Children often respond with thoughts like, I have to use a low voice, or I have to get my work done. The teachers also create text with children that focus on bringing children's hearts, souls, and heritages into the classroom. Further, they share books, which can also be done during the pandemic, that honor children's cultures, languages, and heritages. This presentation has shared how, as the year begins, teachers like the ones that I showed you on the second slide foster communal love through practices and routines that develop children's understanding of how to be in a communal loving space that is embedded within a larger community. Critical sociocultural theory and culturally sustaining pedagogies help us see that in order to build, extend, and sustain people's local and cultural knowledge, we have to recognize that children are full little people that merit powerful examples of language and literacy instruction that honors that fullness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kindel, and also Jennifer and Keisha for your presentations to start off the first half of the session. We will now take a 5-minute break, and we will continue after the break with Tracy, Jiyoon, and Mavis's presentation. We invite the audience, as I mentioned at the outset, to upload your questions to the Q&A box during the presentations. We will come back to those during the discussion portion at the end. So we'll see you in 5 minutes. Okay, welcome back from the break, everyone. And we continue with a presentation by Dr. Irish.
Thank you, Dr. Hult, and thank you, everybody that presented before me. I'm really learning a lot today. My presentation is much different, so stick with me, and by the end, we'll link up more with literacy and the topic of the day. So I'm going to be talking about STEM literacy. And first, I just wanted to make a quick note on the definition of what is STEM education. It's an interdisciplinary approach to teaching and learning where we're looking at academic concepts with real-world lessons, real-world issues and problems across the S, the T, the E, and the M, but also to make connections between school, community, work, and really the entire world. So STEM education lends itself to disciplinary literacy, which is the context of the discipline, but not only, it's not really just a literacy, it's also the unique practices used by those specialists and people within that discipline, and how the knowledge and abilities in that discipline are used to create, communicate, and use that knowledge to create and the work within that discipline. So each of the individual disciplines within STEM have definitions for their own literacies. I've underlined the components that I think are the most important. Is it's not only knowledge about that discipline, but it's also understanding, being able to do decision-making, participating in the actual activities and productivities within that, using creativity, innovation, and engage in not only individuals' lives, but the occupation and the well-being of all individuals and of the world, really. Before I really define STEM literacy, I'd like to bring up the 21st century education that came about in about 2011, 2012, because it really, to me, is a non-STEM version of STEM education, because it talks about communication, collaboration, critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, and it brings up all of the literacies: reading, math, science, technology, and civic literacy. So I would like to point out that 21st century education also shows how social studies and political science, and as well as really with the creativity, the arts, all play a role within STEM education. And the 21st century literacies also talks about foundational knowledge, the literacies and the competencies in terms of these skills and other capabilities within that discipline to be successful across all parts of life. In the STEM field, we look at integrated STEM education in terms of the goals for students, the outcomes for students, what this means in terms of the nature and scope of developing lessons and integrating and implementing for a teacher. And so this is sort of like the STEM version of the previous slide, the way I see it. So there's different definitions out there of STEM literacy. The first one defines STEM literacy as simply the ability to adapt and accept changes by technology, communicate complex ideas, and to find measured creative solutions to problems. That grew a little bit into Balka's work with STEM literacy is the ability to identify, apply, integrate concepts across the S, the T, the E, and the M to understand complex problems and to innovate to solve them. But the work of Zollman talks about really it's the individual literacies of the 4 different disciplines, but also the personal, societal, and economic needs, and bringing in the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor learning domains as we're teaching STEM and STEM literacy to our students. So really, why STEM literacy? I think that for me, there's two basic reasons why STEM literacy is important. And it's the impact of all humans on the earth, but it's also the impact of the world on humans. So really, the new generation, we've left the world in a certain state that there are societal needs for new technological and scientific advances and innovations. It links with the national security, and there are personal needs to become fulfilled, productive, and a knowledgeable citizen. And the context for all of this is I run a STEM master's program for certified teachers in STEM education. And when I first started developing the program and first started teaching, I really thought of STEM as a content, and I really wanted to increase the teachers' content knowledge within science, technology, engineering, and math, and show them the way that they connect. But as I continued to build and grow the program, it dawned on me that it's not just STEM, the concept of STEM, but it's really a STEM literacy, because I feel like STEM literacy is something that all citizens of the world need to be able to understand what's going on and be able to make positive changes to the world. So I've sort of done a flip, and I've looked at even the standards differently. Instead of using the content standards, I'm using the science literacy. One course is on environmental science, and we look a lot at the environmental science literacy standards. So it's been a change for me over time to see the importance of literacy and what literacy means in STEM. In terms of specific concepts that we're dealing with right now, of course, the pandemic, this leads to some lessons that we've developed in STEM that I've developed and used with airborne diseases, airborne viruses, and the chain of infection. Also antibiotics and what they treat, and why you get them sometimes and why sometimes you don't. As I said, I mentioned the environmental science class, and there's a lot of environmental issues that we deal with. Pesticides. We did a lot of work on the Love Canal, which was in Upper New York, which ended up in a major disaster for a very large community that was actually built right on top of land that was never supposed to be developed because of the underground tanks filled with pesticide and radioactive material. And we also talk about using pesticides and fertilizer in your yard, because there's a huge lawsuit right now with Roundup, finding out that it causes cancer. There's also ozone and emissions and the air quality and climate change, and we could go on, but these are certainly issues that are going on right now, that being STEM literate would help you become a more informed citizen to understand what this means to you, what this means to the world as we live in it, and how you can be a part of the solution. I don't know if I'll have time for all of this, but an example of a middle school lesson plan from Engineering Go For It is about I breathe what? And so this is students just gain an appreciation of what's really in the air that we breathe. And after they learn about what's in the air, they also think about what types of devices have been used to clean our air and what kind of device they might be able to build using the engineering design process. So if we look a little bit about the background reading, I know this is difficult to see, but really you can see the science, the technology, the engineering, and the math all within here. They talk about the smoke, and it has the math. A quart of air contains about 70,000 small particles, 25,400 microns in an inch. People can see things as small as 10 microns if the light is good. Then it starts talking about what this has to do with you and particles in the air making people sick. And then we bring out the Environmental Protection Agency, because it's a good resource for students that once they read this background information, they have more that they need to know. And so we give them resources where they can go and learn more. And then we get into it where we actually talk about the kind of work that they're going to be going into. Let me see if I can find it. So after they've read this, we would ask discussions such as, what are some man-made sources of particulate matter? And how do we reduce some of these things? And the engineering design process that they do is very inexpensive. It takes index card string and double sticky tape. And they simply make a device that they hang in various places, either throughout their house or throughout their school, outside. So they can start collecting things on this double sticky tape of particles that are in the air. And then they can look at them with just the naked eye and also with a not a microscope, but a okay, I can't think of it, magnifying glass. So this is just sort of an example of the reading that brings in the science, the technology, the engineering, and the math that hopefully engages students enough to want to learn more. They can go and they can, certainly for the younger grades, we give them additional resources that they can read through. For the older grades, we have them use the internet and give them, various websites like the EPA where they can go and find information. And then they eventually build their devices, and then they do more research about what is out there, what other companies are building to try to help save this problem. We use a lot of models in STEM education, so this is a good model, just thinking about our air and where stuff is coming from and what it might be leaving behind. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Today, I want to talk about the collaborative approach to language assessment literacy development. When I got the invitation from Francis, I wanted to know the exact definition of literacy, what we are actually talking about. So I went into the UNESCO website, and then they defined literacy as ability to identify, understand, interpret, create, and communicate and compute using printed and written materials associated with varying contexts. Especially what resonated me a lot was the following sentence. Literacy involves a continuum of learning and enabling individuals to achieve their goals, to develop their knowledge and potential, and to participate fully in their community and wider society, which was very well connected with language assessment literacy that I want to talk about today. Roughly defined as language assessment literacy is stakeholders' knowledge about language assessment principles and theories, and its sociocultural, political, ethical, pedagogical consequences. And it also refers to their skills to design and implement theoretically sound language assessment. And then finally, their abilities to interpret or share assessment results with other stakeholders. Based on these definitions, there are many scholars who presented different components or how we should define the details about language assessment literacy. I don't think I'll have enough time to go over everything, but as you can see here, depending on the scholars, the subcomponents of language assessment literacy slightly varies. And based on their arguments, in 2019 article, I presented a model of language assessment literacy that we can use to educate teachers. So the first part is that Taylor mentioned that training for language assessment literacy entails an appropriate balance of technical know-how, practical skills, and theoretical knowledge and understanding of principles. So based on that, this model presented three factors, which are three components, which are the assessment principles, which is an understanding of theoretical aspects of assessment, often refers to the ideas about validity, reliability, cognitive, and metacognitive processes of assessment. And then assessment skills, which refers to the abilities to develop and then appreciate assessment. And then the assessment consequences is the understanding of the social, cultural, political, pedagogical consequences and its impact, issues of fairness and just and ethics and professionalism. And then in this particular model, the core of this model is that language teachers' understanding of language teaching and learning principles, which is based on Bachman's idea that advances in language testing do not take place in a vacuum. They are stimulated by advances in understanding of the processes of language acquisition and language testing. In this model, I really wanted to emphasize that language assessment is not something that's separate alone, but it's deeply related to language learning and teaching. To initiate the empirical study that I'm going to introduce today, I had various questions, and which is also related to the design of my courses. So I wanted to make sure that the course I'm teaching, which is language assessment for language teachers, would make a positive impact to improve their knowledge of language assessment. And designing the course, I wanted to make sure that I don't have to repeat what my pre-service teacher would know already. So these are the kind of questions I started with. And I went on to the literature, what they found so far. And then, not surprisingly, studies show that both pre and in-service teachers do not have enough education on assessment, and they have various needs in both theoretical and practical knowledge. On a positive note, teachers who received education on assessment could have more confidence and then improved understanding of assessment. And there are studies that show that positive correlation between teachers, enhanced language assessment literacy, and then learners' learning processes and outcome. So this is a question I started with. And I worked with in-service teachers in Baltimore City. And when I talked to her, I'm going to show you the information of her soon. But when I talked to her about the course, she told me that she's been mentoring many pre-service teachers. And then when they come, they bring some new knowledge, and then she wants to know more about it. And then on the right-hand side, you will see the pre-service teachers' needs. And then you can see their concerns that they do not have enough knowledge. They said that they just used other people's tests before, and then they worried about the fairness and the valid and reliability issues of their assessment. Keeping those in mind, this is the design of my course. The in-service teacher I worked with was Ms. Natalia Goldenberg in the Baltimore City. And then I also worked with 20-something pre-service teachers, but in this particular study, I particularly worked with Debbie. And in this assessment course, from months 1 to 4, students were exposed to the theoretical ideas about assessment and other skills, how to design and listening and writing assessment, etc. And one of the most important projects in this course was assessment development project, which included test taker needs analysis, construct definition, and then they developed assessment, and then they evaluated test takers' performance using the rubric they designed, and then they critique their own assessment. And we asked this in-service teacher to implement the assessment that my pre-service teachers developed, and then they implemented among the students, ESL students in Baltimore City, and at the end, we had a debrief meeting. And this is an example of the assessment, writing assessment that my pre-service teachers made using Google Form. The basic finding here is that the in-service teacher mentioned that she also she submitted a report to the National Board of Professional Teaching Standards, and then it shows that she had the largest area of her professional growth was the understanding of assessment, and she contributed that the collaboration between me and then our pre-service teachers was one of the defining factors for that. And then also interesting note she made was that she expected the assessment created by my students to be a learning experience, was also the learning experience for her students, because her students also gave us some sort of comments on the assessment they practiced. And then pre-service teacher mentioned that the reading materials and all the lecture and activities were helpful, but most helpful thing was that the interaction with in-service teachers, and then the actual hands-on opportunity helped them to understand the assessment better, which could be interpreted as the advancement of their assessment, language assessment literacy. As a teacher educator, I also believe that the collaboration with in-service and pre-service teachers helped me better understand the needs of both groups and how to design my course more effectively. And it also gave me more opportunities to think about other stakeholders in education who can benefit from language assessment literacy enhancement. And then during this pandemic, we were able to continue the interaction through the Zoom and Skype and emails. And the assessment development was done through the Google Form and YouTube. So it also, there was a challenge because we couldn't really necessarily implement the assessment among the students in class, but at the same time, we were able to connect the learners from all over the world. So one of the pre-service teachers, they didn't work with Mrs. Goldenberg, could implement it as students in Hong Kong. And the later one, I was thinking about learners and then families' language assessment literacy development would be also important in this particular time. So here, I would like to present the future research on language assessment literacy. We still continue to work on the teachers' language assessment literacy research. This is still early stage, and we still need to know how to improve our teachers' language assessment literacy. And at the same time, as Mrs. Goldenberg mentioned, that learners' language assessment literacy matters also here. And then the advanced learners' assessment literacy help them to be more autonomous on their own learning, which we had some publications in preparation and then also under review on that topic. And finally, families' language assessment literacy became also important during this school closure, and when there was a disconnection between learners and teachers in terms of the schooling. So here we also need to think about how we can support families' language assessment literacy development so they can interpret testing results and assessment results, and then support learners' assessment literacy, learning itself. Okay, this is about it. And okay, so I'll finish my presentation here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on this day where we're focusing on literacy and I'm the last presenter not to talk about my research on literacy or any study that I'm involved in, but to really talk about how the Sherman Center for Early Learning in Urban Communities tries to facilitate the kind of research that has been shared today and that can promote advancements in literacy and the extension of literacy to more children and adults around the globe. And so I want to start a little bit with giving you some background on the Sherman Center for Early Learning in Urban Communities. It was established in 2017 from a very generous gift from George and Betsy Sherman. Betsy Sherman was an early educator, and she understands the importance of literacy for all of the reasons that Dr. Hult described at the very beginning of this session today. So when we were thinking about literacy, we understood that it had to be, or when we talked about the development of the center, we understood that really to engage in the kinds of research and to make the difference that we were seeking to make, that it should be multidisciplinary and also applied. We focus on young learners, ages birth to 8. In the U.S., that translates basically from birth until about 2nd grade. And we decided to focus on reading literacy or reading and writing literacy. It has been the primary focus since the inception of the center, simply because we see literacy as a gateway to other learning, to all types of opportunities, both in childhood and adulthood. We follow a particular theory of change that evolves through our work and through our conversations with our various partners. We provide professional and leadership development. So you'll see at the very bottom of this slide, you see the circle. It represents the fact of the interconnectedness between families, schools, and communities to support our ultimate goal of improving the educational experiences and outcomes of young children in urban communities like Baltimore City. So we know that that's important for us to get to educators, to understand what they are doing well, and to identify best practices so that we can improve the performance of teachers in the classroom who are engaging with those students and those families every day. So we have a Teacher Summer Institute where we bring early childhood educators together to share some of the research that is being conducted and some best practices. We also have instituted the Maryland Early Childhood Leadership Program because we understand in order for us to advance literacy, we need leaders in the field who are prepared to do that and feel confident and competent as leaders to make a difference in the lives of others. We also center our work around partnerships. We partner with schools, we partner with educators, we partner with families, and we partner with community-based organizations because we know that no one entity can really achieve the outcomes that we're looking for if we are to expand and advance literacy for all. We have a diverse books project where we identify some of the best multicultural literature out there for young people, and we try to get that into schools, into families, and into the hands of young learners. We have the Families, Libraries, and Early Literacy project, where we work with families of children birth to 3 to help them understand how they can support literacy practices at home and also prepare their children for schooling so that they can take full advantage of whatever educational opportunities are available to them. And we also have the Literacy Fellows program, where we help to identify UMBC undergraduate students who can serve as literacy volunteers in schools in Baltimore City so that they can support teachers in their literacy role, as well as support young children and be role models for them in the classroom. Finally, we try to support multidisciplinary research in schools. And we do that in a couple of ways, by recruiting teachers and faculty that are onto UMBC's campus who are interested in early literacy, early childhood studies. And we also fund research from various academics on UMBC's campus so that we can advance and knowledge about what makes a difference for the literacy development of young children. We take a very sort of geographic approach. So you'll see the map here. It's a bit dated, but it gives you a sense of where the university is and then where our partner schools are. When we first constructed this map or developed this map, Baybrook was in a temporary location. It actually should be further down below Curtis Bay Elementary School. And there's a new school, Arundel Elementary School, that is here. So we have 5 schools that are in close proximity to the university, but importantly, they're in close proximity to one another. Our desire is to create a learning community. Again, we understand that there's no one entity that has all of the answers that can really advance research and practice alone. And so by creating this learning community in ways that are easily sort of connected, the educators are learning not only from the faculty who are doing this amazing research at UMBC, but also from each other. And in turn, the faculty in UMBC have access to schools that embrace the value of research and really have a common goal around advancing students' learning and understanding. And so some examples of some research practice partnerships that have been facilitated and supported by the Sherman Center include one of the studies that was described in the symposium today, the Dual Language Program Effects for Latinx and African American Early Learners in an Urban School by Dr. Jennifer Mata-McMahon. Dr. McMahon is a research faculty at the Sherman Center, and the Sherman Center has the privilege of supporting a lot of the work that she is doing there at a local school. Another presenter today, Dr. Kindel Nash, even though we did not fund or support the study that she described today, we have supported some research that she is doing with others around promoting the literacy, proficiency, and fluency of early learners through a program called Read to Impress. Also, Susan Sonnenschein, who is also at UMBC, but in the psychology department, and Claudia Galindo at the University of Maryland. They are both looking at the effects of one of the Sherman Center projects, the Literacy Fellows Project, on the outcome of first and second grade students. And so when we think about these research practice partnerships, why are they important? What are some of the key features of them? All of the research questions that emerge through these research practice partnerships are sort of derived in collaboration with the schools. So it's not just the researcher coming in and saying, I'm interested in this, but really it's a partnership to say, this is my interest. How does it relate to the interests and the goals that you have for the students within this particular school? And from that, it emerges a sort of collaborative question, and it reflects the shared interests and needs of both the educators, the educational leaders, as well as the researchers, the students, and the families. Student, family, educator input is critical and very clear in all of the studies. So the teachers, the students, the families, they have input and they are participants. And so what we learn, we don't learn outside of the context of teaching and learning and family engagement, we learn it through the input of teachers and families and students. These studies are longitudinal and iterative. So all of the studies that we have supported have really been at least a year or more in the field. They are iterative in the sense that as some questions are asked and answered, other questions arise. And that they, because of the relationships they have in the building, they can then begin to pursue those questions as well. And so the types of findings are ongoing, but they allow direct application within the school setting because they are coming directly from that particular school setting. And that is a fourth element of these research practice partnerships. They have clear and direct implications for practice and practice on the ground. So as practice improves and changes as a result of the findings, other questions emerge, and the longitudinal design allows for the pursuit of those as well. And then finally, the Sherman Center, because of its theory of change and because it is grounded in partnerships and professional development, the research that is conducted can be immediately translated into professional development for our educators, as well as shared in the sort of traditional ways that researchers share their findings. So conference papers, publications in refereed journals. We not only promote the dissemination of such findings through our professional development, but we also make sure that our website becomes a site for sharing the information that is published in reports and journals and in conference proceedings. We make sure that those are also posted on our website. And so it creates this feedback loop to really make a difference in sort of advanced research-informed practice within the partner schools as well as beyond. And so I encourage participants who are interested in how we think about advancing literacy, how we think about improving educational outcomes from families in vulnerable communities, to visit our website, and we'd be more than happy. We also have our contact information there, and we'll be more than happy to share any information about the design, about the types of research that we're encouraging, about the types of communication connections we make, and the difference that we're measuring in the schools that we have the privilege of working in. So thank you so much for your time and your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanders, and also Dr. Irish and Dr. Lena for your presentations in the second half of the program. I'd like to now invite all the panelists to turn their mics on, and we'll begin the panel discussion portion of the event. And again, the audience members are invited to put questions in the Q&A box on the side there, and we will look at those. I've been taking some notes as we go to jot down questions folks have posted and some other things too. So I'll start us off with a question for all of us to think about. So typically when people hear about the word development or sustainable development, they tend to think about economics and money. And really, ultimately, development is about equitable access and individual agency. And a lot of what we've talked about today has to do with how we can foster that. And so a question for all the panelists is, how does your work speak to how we are facilitating students' agency and access to educational opportunities?
Well, I would say, again, so much of the work that we do has been funded by a generous sort of gifts from philanthropists, and they have allowed us to then engage with families in a very unique way, so that our outreach to the families of young children, we're trying to empower them with information so that they can be sort of critical consumers of education. Because increasingly, we know that the educational opportunities that are available to individuals, whether they're in urban context, rural context, whether it's online, whether it's face-to-face, has a lot to do with how much information families have about those opportunities, whether or not families have the resources that they can go to ensure that access is available to them for information, for tools that they can use. And so by going directly to the families of these young people, we are trying to empower them and build their agency so that they can go out there, they know the resources that are available to them, and they can be more critical, and they also know individuals that they can go to for support, for help, and for assistance, et cetera, et cetera. And so in terms of building the agency of students, because we're dealing with very young people, we sort of try to build the agency of family to be empowered to seek out the sort of educational opportunities that are available to them.
Any thoughts from our other panelists on this? How does your work facilitate or encourage the development of students' agency and equitable access to educational opportunities?
So earlier, as I mentioned, that when my pre-service teachers developed the assessment, the in-service teacher implemented in her own classroom, and we seek the students' advice or feedback on that assessment. That actually really empowered even young learners, second grade, sixth graders, to think more critically about their assessment practices. And eventually it helped me kind of like figure some research topic about learners' assessment literacy, because in many cases we ignore or don't even think about learners' assessment literacy, what they know and how they can use assessment more judiciously for their own learning. So I would say enhancing teachers' assessment literacy, families' assessment literacy, and also learners' assessment literacy eventually help them to be more autonomous and then responsible their own learning.
I have a quick response. I'm still formulating it in my head. The development of racial literacy as a pedagogical practice is really kind of an answer to Freire's critique of education, of banking models of education. And so it empowers particularly historically marginalized students to be critical of the education that's being delivered to them, and to also critique the world around them. So I view that as an empowering way that students are then able to advocate for themselves.
And I was going to add that a key feature of the framework of culturally sustaining pedagogy is building on student agency and thinking about what that looks like in radically different ways. So asking a question in a radically different way, thinking about children and where they come from in a radically different way, and thinking about them as connected to communities and families, and thinking about what does it look like to build agency. So.
I was thinking about the 40% of the world's students that are taught in languages that they don't understand statistic, and it sort of put the work that I'm doing in terms of looking at this program and the work that the school is doing at designing and implementing a dual language program based on the needs of the students in a brighter context for me. But in terms of agency of students, one of the things that we discovered in looking at ownership for this program was that when we were coding for this in the qualitative data, the students were the ones who were bringing up aspects of ownership that we were seeing salient for this particular code, which is one of the pillars that we were looking at. And it seemed really interesting that it was for them, the depth and the spread of the program was coming from the teachers, the administrators, the staff, but the ownership that then relates to the sustainability of the program over time was coming from the students. And I think that was really telling in terms of how not only was the school meeting their needs, but how they were realizing the empowerment it was for them to be taught in their language and shift the way that they saw their native language as it was being perceived by the school. So in creating this program, there's a highlight of the Spanish language that is embedded in this community as part of this community's culture that wasn't there before. And I think that sense of recognition of value for their language was really important and was showing out in the data of how the children felt about the program. And the other component, I think, of agency comes back to what Dr. Sanders was saying about families, and when you're working with younger children, how empowering the family is going to, and giving agency to the family is going to be it's going to have a very positive impact on the students themselves and their learning outcomes. And in our preliminary look at that data, the families were reporting how they were now so much more engaged in their student learning, whereas before they really didn't know what was happening because they didn't understand the language in which they were being taught. That's powerful to not only think about the agency of the students, but the agency of the families as well, and how we get the families involved in the student learning.
Do we have time for one more?
Go ahead, Dr. Iris, if you have a thought.
Thank you. I think for STEM education, when it's done right, all students are engaged. It can be from pre-K through adulthood, but the way that STEM should be engaging is to have them do readings and find out a problem, but then they work in teams to brainstorm and come up with possible solutions and possible ways to implement that solution. And again, when it's done right, the power within those teams of ensuring that all students have a voice, all students can add to the concept that the team is going to move forward with, empowers students, it engages students, and it aligns across all content areas. So it really is about making sure there's access for all students to really engage in this meaningfully.
That's an excellent point. So we have a follow-up question about access and equity as it relates to the economic dimension. This is from an audience participant who's wondering about the tension between public and private education, that there's a growing tendency to see privatized education as a ticket to more rigorous education, but then that has implications for who has access to that. And so he's wondering if you have any thoughts on how a teacher should respond to parents and families who might be wondering whether private education is a better opportunity for their children than public education when it comes to educational opportunities.
Well, Dr. Hult, when you first sort of started the panel and you sort of introduced this topic of literacy, I mean, you provided a global context, right? And in that global context, we realized that there's such diversity out there that absolute answers are probably oversimplifying the diversity of issues that different communities face. And so even within the context of the U.S., for marginalized communities at different historical periods, private education has been really important because it was the only sort of educational avenue that was available to those marginalized communities. It was the only way to have a culturally sustaining educational opportunity. And so, I think when we're dealing with that kind of complexity, those sort of binaries don't take us very far because they in some way obscure all of the complexity that's out there. But I will say that we know that public education has been a safety net in so many societies, especially, whether it's industrialized societies, non-industrialized societies, regardless, the public education sphere has played a very significant and important role. And I personally am an advocate of public schools and being engaged in the process of making sure that public schools provide as high quality an educational service as they possibly can. It is I view it as a very sort of democratizing institution, and so making sure that there's varied access to public education is really important. And so that's the reason the center chooses to work with underserved public schools in this urban context to improve the practice in those schools, to be able to produce research and new knowledge that other public schools can then utilize and try to improve that in the public sphere. So I would just say my response is probably not, which is better, because it will depend on the context and the population and what's available, but that a strong commitment to public schools has been a tool that nations have used. When we think about, Singapore and other nations that have become industrialized, public education has been a tool for that. When you think about expanding opportunities in the United States, public schools have been a part of that. And so commitment to public schools and improving them is part of the Sherman Center's work, and it's part of something that we all can sort of talk about the importance of. And I'll leave it there.
Does anyone else have a thought on this question? If not, then a follow-up question that touches on something that Dr. Sanders mentioned here is the specific needs of minoritized students. So this is also a question for all the panelists and the work that you've described in particular. And what would you say are the most salient issues when it comes to literacy development and educational opportunities, both before and now during and after COVID, specifically for minoritized students?
Well, I can speak to that. I was kind of waiting for Dr. Allen to make sure that she didn't want to say anything. I think that right now it's really important to think about context, like Dr. Sanders was speaking to. And I think it's important to think about context from a realistic perspective, but not a deficit perspective. I think often, in my experience as an urban school teacher and a parent of child child in urban schools, that the way kids and families are framed in this context is through a deficit lens. And so I think that one of the challenges and one of the possibilities is to begin to reimagine how we think about communities and how we think about Black and Brown communities as spaces of resilience and spaces with funds of knowledge that we can tap into in education. And that, I mean, that's certainly in the project that I described today, which is a forthcoming book. And then in my latest book, this is, with teachers, that this is certainly what these teachers have demonstrated, ways of addressing children as full humans, no matter what their background, what their context.
One thing that I was thinking about and that I often share with my students in my literacies in the content area, of course, is that there's a historical legacy of literacy within Black communities and the desire to be literate. And so I think that that's important for both educators and for Black students, African-American students, to know and to build upon that legacy. I'm thinking about the work of Goldie Muhammad and her historical research around, and I might be butchering the group, but around literacy councils. I'm thinking about during the civil rights movement and the importance of literacy for African Americans to pursue voting rights and to assert their humanity. So I think that, going back to this idea of context again, is that to going outside of this current moment and the narratives around literacy and historically marginalized communities, and really thinking about how literacy has shown up historically and how it may have also shown up in other ways that has been kind of unrecognizable, perhaps, by westernized notions of literacy. And so thinking about the home literacies that students are engaging at home, and then particularly in this moment, thinking about how we can leverage those literacies as students acquire academic literacy.
We have another follow-up question from an audience member that takes it down to the level of practice, what teachers can do. She asks, today is the first day of school for many teachers, and with limited bandwidth, and here I think we can say both limited bandwidth physically because of the internet challenges and connectivity people have, but also metaphorically, the limited bandwidth we have mentally with COVID. What is one practical bit of advice that you would offer teachers to add to their toolkit or daily routine to support their students' language, culture, and background?
Well, I think that's what my whole presentation was about. Practices at the beginning of the year to go beyond creating community, but recognizing that kids are part of communities already. And so there are some very simple things that you can do. The restorative practices framework and community circles, incorporating that into morning meeting would be a wonderful and very small adjustment that all teachers across the nation could make.
And I just want to add, and not just doing it as a performative thing, but actually using those check-in points to, yes, create community, but then also to use, keep going back to what other students are sharing, or to use that as a point of, a check-in point for students, and to, as you're developing curricula, or even just checking in to see, how students are doing and following up their social well-being.
And we had the opportunity of having, during our Teacher Summer Institute, we had a Patricia Jennings from the University of Virginia, and she talked about the importance, too, of teachers taking care of themselves, checking in with themselves, making sure that, because when we think about teachers, oftentimes we don't think about them as also being parents, as also being children, as also, trying to deal with their own concerns during this time, their own access to technology often. And so for teachers to take a moment every day to make sure that they're grounded, to make sure that whether it is, a breathing exercise, a treat at the end of the day, at the beginning of the day, whether it's meditation, whatever you need in order to be grounded so that you can give yourself fully to the students and the families when you have access to them. And I would say also look for those resources. To a certain extent, our partner schools and the educators in our partner schools, the early educators, are lucky, right? Because they have the Sherman Center as a resource. So if they need to have some extra support online, we have wonderful UMBC students who are volunteering to be online with that teacher during the literacy period to take a small group, right? If they need additional books in the classroom that they want to share with their children around the coronavirus, we had several teachers order the books to explain to children what coronavirus is. So, and they're using that text to both educate and to open discussion. All teachers don't have that, but you'd be surprised at how many families, how many community organizations around you would be interested in partnering with you during this moment of crisis because they want to feel as though they're making a difference too. So, taking care of yourself, but also looking for partners who can assist you in this work, even if it means assisting you with figuring out who's in attendance and who's not, so you can do the follow-up by phone call or by text to those families who may not be able to fully access the educational opportunities you provide online. So look for partnerships. Look to universities, look to faculty like these amazing people here who are doing this work and who can give some guidance and support, and also just take care of yourself in this process so you can be fully present for your students.
Along those lines, I just wanted to share, there's something I'm doing with my pre-service students that are doing student teaching. I've redesigned the seminar so that it's focused on children's spirituality, and one of the ways that we support that is through a meditation project to promote mindfulness. And one of the things I do for my students, they try to promote this in the children that they're working with and their students, is that I give them meditation techniques each week. And I'll post it in the Q&A, the link to that, because I have them all online, and you can access them. And there's 14 different techniques that you not necessarily do them in that order, but pick and choose which ones would be interesting for you. And I think that that's a really good way to give yourself the support that you need to then provide the support that the children and the families that you work with need.
If I could add in just two very easy sort of practices that I have been using is to make sure that you have backup. So if you're having a synchronous visual meeting with your students and some of them can't come, make sure that you have a pre-taped version of that they can watch to make sure they don't feel like they've missed everything, and make sure they know that that's an option for them. And if there's a reading or a worksheet or some sort of document that they need that they don't have for whatever reason, make sure you've listed in the curriculum options. So if they don't have that one, if you can't find this one, read this one, because it's the same kind of thing. So I think being flexible, having backup, and having different options for you yourself as a teacher as you're teaching, and also for your students in terms of the resources that they use.
That is an excellent and practical point and a good place for us to finish. We're right out of time. And so thank you for those final thoughts about how we can relate research to practice and also consider the everyday needs of both academic and psychological of teachers. So thank you once again to all of the panelists for joining us today and sharing your research and thoughts with us. Thank you to our wonderful participants who are here with us today. You will receive information about where to find the recording of this session afterwards. And we hope that you have an excellent start of the school year and academic term and manage the challenges and perhaps opportunities that come with the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you very much.